Welcome to Clips, where we snip out little facts and factoids from our much more in-depth series. Today, our episode is brought to you by the letter F for my friend, Jonathan Ferguson, who pointed out to me that our language usage around the, let's say, single action, or let's say double action revolvers and subsequent pistols in general has evolved away from its original meaning. Let's start by explaining what the most common modern interpretation of those two words actually mean. Alright, this is a reproduction of a Colt single-action army. I believe this one was done by Uberti. Now, what's important about it is actually in the name, single action. This is what's known as a single action only revolver, SAO, and that means that as it sits here, unloaded, mind you, we are always sure of that. As it sits here, if I pull the trigger, nothing happens because the hammer is already down. If the hammer is, let's say, in the half cock position and I pull the trigger, nothing happens. That's actually by design. But when I go to the full cock position, I may now, and you may have noticed that trigger's indexed a bit, I may now use the trigger. So that means we must cock before firing. Now, in our modern understanding, we call this single action because the trigger is performing a singular action. It is releasing the hammer. All right? That was not always the way it was understood, but this is how we see it today. Let's look at a double action. This is a Japanese Type 26 revolver. This gun, again, and we don't usually make a habit of this, but that's unloaded. So, this gun is what's known as a double action only, or a DAO. And in this case, you may notice that there's no spur on the hammer. If I try to cock the hammer, as a matter of fact, it's not staying back at all. Instead, this gun's designed to only fire by pulling the trigger all the way through. So, boom, boom. Now, in the modern understanding, we call this a double action because the trigger is both cocking and releasing the hammer. Although, as we'll talk about in a moment, not always the case. Now, I know a lot of you are aware that most revolvers can do both of those operations, but stay with me for a moment. Long ago, revolvers were a fairly new concept, and there are basically two designs that we need to start with for this explanation. This is the Colt 1851 Navy, an incredibly popular single-action-only revolver, and this is the 1851 Adams, especially popular with the United Kingdom, a double-action-only revolver in our modern understanding. Both of these are, of course, percussion cap muzzle-loading black powder firearms. So up until that point, the common understanding of a revolver was that you cock the hammer with your thumb and then pull the trigger like we saw before. With the introduction of the Adams, you just had to pull that trigger over and over and over again, just like this guy, boom, boom, boom. Now, neither Jonathan nor I have done a ton of digging, but even a cursory search shows that by the late 1850s, the terms we know had appeared, but not like you'd expect. In the Revolver, its description, management, and use by Patrick Edward Dove, printed in 1858, we see the term one action used to describe the Adams trigger, as opposed to the two-action Colt cocking and then firing. We also see double action mentioned, which appears to apply to Tranter's dual trigger design from 1853. This is even more confusing because technically if you just pull both triggers, the Tranter acts like a modern double action. This sort of confusion quickly gave way to something closer to our modern understanding, sort of. The Modern Sportsman's Gun and Rifle by John Henry Walsh in 1884 used the term single action to refer to both the trigger-actuated British and hammer-cocked US designs, and for a few years this seemed to be the prominent way of referring to these guns. Although, that likely came as a response to newer designs that incorporated both of the previous actions, as in, they had two actions. When the Colt 1877 and 1878 revolvers were first being advertised, they were marketed as double action, which went on to explain either self-cocking or thumb cocking. Now, somewhere in the late 1880s or early 1890s, this started to change, because we'll see some more confusion. The 1896 textbook of Ordnance and Gunnery still defines a double action as a gun capable of either single action or self-cocking operation. However, the 1891 Chambers Encyclopedia describes a double-action revolver as one in which pulling the trigger both raises and releases the hammer, those being the two actions, cocking and releasing. In this work, single-action revolvers required the hammer to be cocked manually. That's exactly how we'd define it today. In Notes of Military Interest of 1901, a report on the Russian Nagant 1895 records the soldier's model as a single action, so thumb cocked and trigger fired, and the officer's as a triple action, in this case meaning capable of both double action, self-cocking, or single action, hammer cocking. Okay, so that would mean that by 1901 at least, things had really started to, in military circles, and likely civilian as well, move right on to what we kind of say today. Single action and double action, plus a term for, let's say, triple action, the ability to do both. Let me make sure I'm being 100% clear by what I mean by that. Now this is a Webley Kaufman, a double and single action revolver, also for a time popularly known as a triple action revolver, in that it can do both double and single. So that means we can cock the hammer, it will stay back and locked, and then we can pull the trigger to drop it. I'm being a little delicate with this old girl. Or I can pull the trigger all the way through, which will cock the hammer, see it going back on its own, and then I'll help it ride down because it goes ahead and releases. So there's our double action. So double and single or triple action. Now, of course, there are still signs that the vernacular hadn't completely shifted, like this 1909 Hopkins and Allen ad for their safety police pistol, which would shift the hammer out of the path of the firing pin whenever the trigger was released. They tried branding this automatic safety process as a third action, and therefore called this a triple action revolver, and tried to brand that into the public consciousness. It does not seem to have worked, however. Eventually, things settled down, and the terms as we know them today did emerge victorious. Single action, double action, and the ability to do both is sometimes called triple, but usually just called single and double action. Hopefully, by showing you how muddy the waters were, I've helped you understand the meanings as they are today. There are certainly other terms like this in firearms history. A good case would be the emergence of semi-automatic, but we'll explore that another day. Until then, have a good one.